All that and more currently on Countdown.
Get my hat, G.
Since Clarence Thomas was nominated 2 decades ago to the Supreme Court, controversy has nearly stalked him. First, an employee named Anita Hill alleged sexual harassment during Thomas's confirmation hearings. Her testimony included references to pubic hair and pornographic films. Now Thomas is the motivation for a congressman who wants the House to consider a bill that might stop some of the free gifts and free trips that Thomas has allegedly enjoyed from right-wing boosters. The measure has been introduced by Representative Chris Murphy of Connecticut.
Our problem is we don't know the full extent of Justice Thomas's connection to Harlan Crow, or frankly, to a further network of right-wing funders. What he's done is incredibly serious. I think at the very least, his action should disqualify him from sitting on any cases in which Crow-affiliated organizations are parties to or have attempted to influence. But this is starting to rise to the level where there should start to be some real investigations as to whether Clarence Thomas can continue to serve as justice on the Supreme Court.
To be sure, Thomas has not been charged with crimes nor with ethics violations. Just as assuredly, Supreme Court justices cannot be charged with ethics violations. That's what the bill would change. There is no move yet to impeach him in a narrowly divided court that often rules in favor of rich over poor, corporations over citizens, and the powerful over the powerless. Thomas has been a reliable rubber stamp for the views of conservative think tanks and right-wing propaganda mills. And a loophole in the American legal system allows softer rules for the Supreme Court than it permits for federal judges at lower levels. Thomas has accepted gifts such as a $15,000 bust of Abraham Lincoln and a Bible that belonged to Frederick Douglass that was valued a decade ago at $19,000. The gift giver was that Texas businessman, Harlan Crow, who reportedly also donated $500,000 to a Tea Party affiliate formed by Thomas's wife, Ginny. Justice Thomas is hardly the only one so honored. To his colleagues, Congressman Murphy writes, there have been alarming reports of justices, most notably Justices Antonin Scalia, Clarence Thomas, and Samuel Alito, attending political events and using their position to fundraise for organizations. We do not believe there should be one set of guidelines for Supreme Court justices and stricter standards for other judges. Justice Thomas received a gift valued at $15,000 from an organization that had a brief pending before his court. Incidents such as these undermine the entire integrity of the entire judiciary. I'm joined now by Countdown contributor Jonathan Turley, law professor at George Washington University in Washington. John, it's good to have you.
Hi, Keith. Welcome back.
Thank you kindly. In the history of the Supreme Court, there has been one justice, Mr. Chase, impeached, but he wasn't removed. Is this, any possibility of happening, an actual impeachment?
I don't think it is a likely chance for impeachment, but I will note, I was counsel for Judge Thomas Porteous. He was the last judge to be impeached and removed. This was just a matter of months ago. Our jury was 100 senators. He was impeached by most of the House members currently in Congress. He was accused of failing to disclose information, just as Justice Thomas has been accused of failing to disclose income from his wife. He was accused of receiving gifts from friends, small things like lunches. So there are similarities between those two cases, and indeed Congress ultimately decided to remove Judge Porteous. There's also Justice Fortas, who got into trouble when he received money for speeches. He was ultimately nominated for Chief Justice by Lyndon Johnson, but he had to withdraw from that. He ultimately left the court because of these types of ties. Now, no one has suggested that Thomas is close to impeachment, but as you noted, this has really brought into full focus the need to have these justices subject to a code of ethics.
Why are they not? How in the world have we lasted this long as a nation with one set of ethics rules for the Supreme Court of the land and another set of far more stringent ones for lesser courts?
Well, you're right to be perplexed. For years, some of us have been arguing they should be subject to it. I've written a number of columns on it. I think it's a ridiculous situation to have justices who are beyond the reach of the Code of Judicial Ethics. Now, the justices say that they comply with those rules, but they really don't, from what I can see. I mean, people like Justice Alito showed very little concern when he was found to be at a political fundraiser. Some of the allegations against Justice Thomas is that he has been engaged in fundraising. as well as conflicts of interest. There's a rather sordid history on the court going back decades in which justices have engaged in some pretty shocking behavior.
Give me a few examples of that, because it's always useful to have the context and understand why previous generations didn't do anything about this problem either.
Well, you know, most people don't realize that the history of the Supreme Court is filled with rather sordid stories. We had one justice who would go out and score drugs, would leave the court and score drugs on the streets of D.C. We've had a long list of justices who were found to be incompetent. But the ones that are most concerned to us in terms of ethics are conflicts of interest. And we've seen with Fortas and other justices these types of uncomfortable relationships with well-heeled friends. And what's strange about this is that when you talk to justices about this gap, they'll often say, look, there's no one here to review us. That's the problem of being supreme, is there's no one above you. And the other argument that they will make is that if one of us recuses, it leaves an even number of 8. And so we can't have this constant drumbeat of people asking to remove us. The worst argument I've heard is from Justice Thomas himself, where after the rather embarrassing disclosure that for decades he has failed to disclose income as required, and in fact filed forms falsely. He said there was no income from his wife, when in fact he was receiving enormous amounts of income as a couple from those sources of money. When he was confronted on that, he gave a speech not long afterwards and warned people that if they attack him, they attack the court, and they're endangering their own freedoms by undermining the court. It was really an amazing sort of repeat of "I am the state," you know, this personification of the court as being myself.
Any sense, based on what Congressman Murphy is proposing, would any change or application of the federal ethics rules for the judiciary to the Supreme Court, would it have any effect on Mrs. Clarence Thomas?
Well, it would have an effect certainly on the justices directly, because it would reaffirm the need to comply with the more stringent rules applied to the federal judges. I don't know of any federal judges that would engage in this type of conduct. It would set up a whole bunch of red flags. But part of the problem, Keith, is there's not only not a binding code of ethics for the justices, there's not really a process. This is so informal. It ultimately comes down to the Chief Justice. And I must say, you know, I really have a lot of disagreements with Chief Justice Roberts, but I thought that he would be good as an administrator on the court. He really was familiar with the court. I'm shocked by his lack of effort in dealing with a series of embarrassing scandals involving justices. If this had been Chief Justice Warren, you know, this would have ended a long time ago. Warren would have gone into this office and say, look, we're temporary holders of this office. You need to clean up your act. And for example, you would think Justice Thomas would insist on total transparency after his admitted violations. He should be clarifying how many free trips he's accepted, things of that type.
John Turley, now Countdown contributor. Great thanks, and have a good weekend.
Thanks, Keith.
Glenn Beck wants to kiss Rick Santorum, quote, in the mouth. You knew this was the way it was going to end, didn't you?